There is a mountaintop in central Virginia where the official record and the genetic record have spent 2 centuries refusing to agree with each other, and the family at the center of that disagreement has a name most Americans already know without knowing why. Monticello sits above Charlottesville the way its builder wanted it to, a house designed and redesigned across 4 decades by a man who owned more than 600 people over the course of his lifetime, and who wrote, in the same decade he was drafting the founding language of the country, that all men are created equal. In the record he kept of that house and that land, one enslaved woman appears again and again in the account books without ever once appearing in his letters as anything more than a name attached to a task. Her name was Sally Hemings. She had 4 children who survived to adulthood, and every one of those 4 children had skin light enough and features close enough to the family upstairs that visitors to the plantation remarked on it in their own letters home. What the census takers wrote down about those children changed, depending on the decade and the county. What the DNA would eventually say about them did not change at all. This is the story of a bloodline that a founding father kept out of his will, out of his letters, and almost entirely out of the written record he left behind for history to judge him by, and of the science that eventually went looking for what he left out. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. To understand why that record stayed so carefully incomplete, you have to understand what Virginia law made of a person like Sally Hemings in the years she lived at Monticello. She was enslaved from birth, the daughter of an enslaved woman named Betty Hemings, and, according to consistent family testimony on both sides of the color line, a white Virginia planter named John Wales, who was also the father of Thomas Jefferson's wife, Martha. That made Sally Hemings and Martha Jefferson half-sisters by blood, one of them born free and married into the house, the other born enslaved and put to work inside it. Virginia's laws in that period followed the mother's status, not the father's, a legal principle called partus sequitur ventrum that had been on the books since 1662, specifically to ensure that children fathered by white men on enslaved women would themselves be born enslaved rather than free. The law did not care whose blood ran in a child. It cared only whose womb they were born from. That single legal mechanism is the reason an entire category of Virginia families, related by blood to the planters who owned them, could be bought, sold, and inherited as property for generation after generation, their parentage an open secret in the county and a closed door in the courthouse. Virginia's obsession with categorizing exactly how much African ancestry a person carried did not end with Jefferson's generation. County clerks in his own era were already recording people under graded terms like mulatto, quadroon, and octoroon, fractional labels meant to track a person's proximity to whiteness in eighths and sixteenths, as though ancestry were a ledger entry rather than a family. That same logic hardened over the following century and reached its final, most rigid form in 1924, when Virginia passed the Racial Integrity Act, a law built on the idea that a single traceable drop of African ancestry made a person legally black regardless of appearance, wealth, or how many generations back that ancestry sat. The office that enforced that law spent decades combing birth and marriage records precisely to catch families who had, in the law's own language, been passing. Sally Hemings' children left Monticello a full century before that law existed, but they were navigating the early, informal version of the exact same system, one that would eventually be written into statute and used to hunt other Virginia families with a documented history of doing precisely what the Hemingses had already done. Jefferson inherited Sally Hemings and her mother's family through his wife's estate in 1774 when Sally Hemings herself was an infant. She grew up at Monticello, and by 1787, at the age of about 14, traveled to Paris as a companion to Jefferson's younger daughter, joining Jefferson there while he served as the American minister to France. Under French law of that period, any enslaved person who set foot on French soil could petition for their freedom, and Sally Hemings, according to the account her son later gave, understood this and considered staying. She returned to Virginia instead, and to slavery, after what her son's account describes as a negotiated agreement with Jefferson himself, one that reportedly included a promise of eventual freedom for any children she might have. She gave birth to at least 6 children over the following years, 4 of whom lived to adulthood: Beverly, Harriet, Madison, and Eston. Every one of Sally Hemings' children who survived into adulthood was, at some point in their life, permitted to leave slavery, either through informal release or through explicit terms in Jefferson's own will. No other enslaved family at Monticello was freed in its entirety like this. That fact alone, sitting untouched in the estate records for 200 years, was one of the first things historians pointed to long before any laboratory got involved. Jefferson was never the only founding-era Virginian whose plantation records carry this exact shape of silence. Genetic genealogy projects built around the surnames of the colonial planter class, families like the Carters, the Randolphs, and the Blands, have turned up the same pattern again and again in recent decades: white male lines whose Y-chromosome markers connect, sometimes unmistakably, to black families descended from the people those same men once owned. Historians researching what has come to be called the first families of Virginia have found that the flow of unacknowledged parentage across the color line was not an isolated event confined to one household on one mountaintop. It was structural, built into a slave economy where a planter's access to the people he owned was total, and a child's legal status depended entirely on the status of the mother who bore them. What makes the Hemings case different is not that it happened. It is that a Y-chromosome study of this particular family reached a national news magazine cover and a peer-reviewed science journal at all, forcing a single, famous instance of an otherwise common colonial pattern into daylight where the rest of the pattern had stayed comfortably out of view. What the plantation records show, and what the family accounts on the Hemings side have always claimed, is not the same document. The farm book that Jefferson kept in his own hand lists Sally Hemings's children by name, by birth date, and by their assigned work, the same ledger in which he tracked the birth of foals and the yield of his tobacco fields. It does not list a father. Jefferson's collected correspondence, thousands of letters that historians have combed through for 2 centuries, contains not one line in which he acknowledges paternity, not one line in which he denies it directly either, and only a handful of oblique references to the persistent public rumor that dogged him for the rest of his political life. In 1802, a journalist and former Jefferson ally named James Callender, angry over a political falling out, published the accusation in a Richmond newspaper, naming Sally Hemings directly and claiming Jefferson had fathered several children with her. The story spread through Federalist newspapers hostile to Jefferson's presidency, was mocked in verse by his political enemies, and was just as quickly dismissed by his defenders and by generations of historians afterward as an unproven slander from a disgraced accuser. For most of the 2 centuries that followed, the official Jefferson scholarship treated the Hemings connection as a footnote at best, an ugly and unverifiable rumor at worst, something a great man's admirers were entitled to set aside. The Hemings family itself never set it aside, because for them it was never a rumor to begin with. In 1873, Madison Hemings, Sally Hemings's 3rd surviving son, then an elderly farmer and carpenter living in Ross County, Ohio, sat down with a local newspaper editor named S.F. Wetmore and gave a detailed account of his mother's life and his own parentage, published that year in the Pike County Republican. Madison Hemings stated plainly that Thomas Jefferson was his father, that his mother had told him the story of the Paris negotiation herself, and that Jefferson had kept his side of that bargain by freeing all 4 of her surviving children as they came of age. He named names, gave dates, and described the physical resemblance visitors to Monticello had always privately remarked on. For over a century, this account sat in an Ohio newspaper archive treated by most Jefferson biographers as the unreliable claim of a formerly enslaved man with an obvious motive to invent a famous father, weighed against the word of a founding father's admiring biographers who preferred a different story. The written record and the family's own testimony stood on opposite sides of the same house for 125 years, and the written record kept winning by default, simply because it was the version that had been allowed to be written down in the first place. Madison Hemings was not the only person from Monticello who spoke on the record that same year. Israel Jefferson, a formerly enslaved man who had worked at Monticello as a manservant during Thomas Jefferson's lifetime, and who took the Jefferson surname himself after gaining his freedom, gave his own interview to the same Ohio newspaper editor in 1873, describing what he had personally witnessed of the relationship between Jefferson and Sally Hemings from his years working inside the house. His account did not carry the same family stake in the outcome that Madison Hemings's did, and it lined up with it in the particulars that mattered: the timing, the household arrangement, the resemblance among the children. 2 separate men, one describing his own parentage and one describing what he had watched from the household staff side of the room, told the same story in the same year in the same small Ohio newspaper, and for 125 years afterward, historians who had never met either of them found it easier to believe neither. That default lasted until 1998, when a retired pathologist named Eugene Foster organized a genetic study specifically designed to test what paper alone could never resolve. The study relied on a quirk of human biology. The Y chromosome passes from father to son almost unchanged across generations. carrying a genetic signature specific to a single paternal line. Foster's team collected Y-chromosome samples from male line descendants of two family branches. The first were descendants of Field Jefferson, Thomas Jefferson's paternal uncle, standing in for Jefferson's own male line, since Jefferson himself left no acknowledged male descendants through his wife. The second were descendants of Eston Hemings, Sally Hemings' youngest son, the child conceived closest to the years Jefferson himself was most reliably documented as being present at Monticello. The results, published that year in the journal Nature, showed a genetic match between the Jefferson male line and the descendants of Eston Hemings, a specific and rare Y-chromosome pattern shared by men whose family trees, on paper, had never been allowed to touch. The study did not, and could not, prove which specific Jefferson man fathered Eston Hemings, since several Jefferson men were regularly present at Monticello during the relevant years, but it did something the written record had refused to do for 125 years. It confirmed that a Jefferson man had fathered a Hemings child, exactly as Madison Hemings' family testimony had always insisted, at precisely the moment Thomas Jefferson himself was the Jefferson most consistently documented as being there. The genetic marker itself, once identified, turned out to be rare enough among the general population that a coincidental match was statistically unlikely in the extreme. Foster's team tested a total of 5 male line descendants across the two family branches, along with additional samples from unrelated European men carrying the same surname lines purely as a control against coincidence, and the rare marker pattern showed up exactly where the Hemings family's own oral history said it should and nowhere it should not have. A single genetic test cannot describe a relationship, a negotiation in Paris, or the specific circumstances under which a child was conceived. It can only describe a biological fact passed silently from father to son for 200 years, immune to what any ledger, will, or newspaper editor chose to leave out. That was the piece of evidence the written record could never produce and never suppress either, because it had never been written down anywhere in the first place. It had been carried, instead, inside the bodies of the people descended from it. The same study delivered a second finding, that the descendants of Sally Hemings' eldest son, Thomas Woodson, did not expect and were not prepared for. Thomas Woodson's family had maintained its own long and proud oral tradition, claiming direct descent from Thomas Jefferson through Sally Hemings' first child, a tradition documented across generations of Woodson family reunions and genealogical records independent of the Hemings-Madison branch. When Foster's team tested male-line Woodson descendants against the same Jefferson genetic marker, the result did not match. Whatever the true parentage of Thomas Woodson turns out to have been, the Y-chromosome evidence available did not connect his line to the Jefferson family the way it connected Eston Hemings' line. This is the detail that keeps the story honest rather than tidy. A single DNA study confirmed one family's oral history in exact genetic detail and left another family's equally sincere oral history unconfirmed, and the difference between those two outcomes is not a flaw in the science. It is exactly what real genealogical evidence looks like once you stop asking it to resolve every branch of a family at once. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The Thomas Jefferson Foundation, the organization that operates Monticello, convened its own research committee in the wake of the Foster study, reviewing the DNA results alongside the documentary record, Jefferson's own presence at Monticello during the relevant conception windows, and the long-dismissed Hemings family testimony. In the year 2000, that committee concluded what the Hemings family had been saying since 1873, that the weight of the evidence, genetic and documentary together, supported Thomas Jefferson as the father of all 6 of Sally Hemings' children, not merely Eston. For nearly 200 years, the difference between what the family said happened and what the official record was permitted to say had been treated as a contest, and the family had been treated as the less credible party in that contest by default, simply because their version of events had never been written into a ledger, a will, or a newspaper editorial with the same institutional authority behind it. The DNA did not create a new story. It confirmed the story that had already been told, out loud, by the people who lived it, and simply gave that story a kind of evidence the written record had never allowed it to have. What the plantation's own paperwork shows about the years immediately following is its own quiet piece of testimony. Jefferson never married Sally Hemings, could not have under Virginia law even if he had wished to, and never freed her outright during his own lifetime, a fact that has troubled even his most sympathetic biographers. But the pattern of what he did with her children stands apart from every other enslaved family whose labor built Monticello. Beverly and Harriet Hemings were allowed to leave the plantation around 1822 without being formally emancipated on paper in a quiet arrangement that let them walk away and be absorbed into free society elsewhere, most likely in the North, where surviving family accounts suggest each of them lived the remainder of their lives passing as white. Madison and Eston Hemings were formally freed in the terms of Jefferson's own will after his death in 1826. The only enslaved family at Monticello granted that specific privilege in its entirety. No other family working that land received anything resembling it. A man who left no written acknowledgement of his own children took the one action available to him that a plantation ledger could not entirely hide, freeing every one of them, one at a time, while never once writing down why. The census record that followed traces exactly what passing required of a family in 19th century America, one decade at a time. Beverly and Harriet Hemings largely vanish from any traceable record after leaving Virginia, which is itself the point. Their disappearance from the historical trail is not evidence they stopped existing. It is evidence they succeeded at exactly what they set out to do, dissolving into the white population so completely that no county clerk ever again had reason to write down the name they were born with. Eston Hemings took a different and better documented path. He lived for a time in Ohio, identified in local records as a free man of color, a respected musician who led his own band, and at some point in the 1850s relocated to Wisconsin, changed his surname from Hemings to Jefferson, and from that point forward was recorded in census documents simply as white. His descendants carried the Jefferson name and the racial classification that came with it for the rest of the century, several generations removed from anyone who might have connected them back to Monticello at all. The paper trail does not describe a family disappearing by accident. It describes a family making a specific, sequential set of decisions, generation after generation, about which name to carry and which box to check, until the county clerk's own record agreed with the choice they had made. Passing, in the specific and documented sense historians use the word, required more than simply moving to a new state. It required a family to sever contact with relatives who had not made the same choice, to raise children who might never be told the full account of where they came from, and to accept that any surviving letter, photograph, or family Bible naming the wrong grandparent could undo generations of careful silence in a single afternoon. Descendants of Beverly and Harriet Hemings, who have been located by genealogists in the years since the 1998 study, grew up, by every available account, with no idea that Monticello had anything to do with their family history at all. Their own parents and grandparents had made certain of it, not out of shame at the fact of their ancestry, but out of a clear-eyed understanding of exactly what 19th and 20th century America was prepared to do to a family correctly identified as descended, even in part, from an enslaved woman. The silence was not an absence of history. It was the history carefully maintained for the plain purpose of keeping the next generation safe. Madison Hemings took the opposite path entirely, and it is the reason this story can be told with his own words at all, rather than reconstructed from silence. He remained in Ohio, identified openly as a man of mixed heritage, worked as a farmer and carpenter, and lived long enough and was interviewed carefully enough in 1873 that his account survives in his own words rather than a descendant's second-hand memory. He did not pass. He did not change his name. He told a newspaper editor exactly who his father was, on the record, under his own name, at a time when doing so offered him no protection and considerable exposure to public disbelief. The fact that this specific account, the one made loudest and most openly, was also the one the genetic evidence would eventually confirm most directly, is not a coincidence historians can easily wave away. The branch of the family that refused to erase itself is the branch whose testimony the 20th century science eventually vindicated in exact genetic detail. The Woodson family did not treat their unmatched result as a closed case, and the research on their branch of the family has continued well past 1998. Because Y-chromosome testing can only trace an unbroken male line, a mismatch on that specific line does not rule out other paths of descent from Sally Hemings or from the wider Hemings and Wales households, including through daughters, half-siblings, or an earlier generation than the test was designed to examine. Woodson family genealogists and independent researchers have continued to comb tax records, church registers, and family papers from the relevant Chesterfield County years, looking for a documentary path the Y-chromosome test was never built to find, and the Thomas Jefferson Foundation's own published position has been to treat the Woodson oral tradition as a serious historical claim, still open to further evidence rather than a settled negative. The lesson the Woodson case leaves behind is a specific and useful one for anyone examining their own family's DNA results. A single genetic test answers a single narrow biological question, and a family's full history can carry true chapters that no one test was ever positioned to confirm or deny. The Jefferson study did not stay contained to one family once it was published. It became almost immediately the reference case that genealogists working on other founding-era Virginia and Carolina plantation dynasties reach for when their own clients' results come back showing an unexpected match across the color line. Genetic genealogy societies formed in the years afterward, specifically to help descendants of the enslaved community at other historic plantations, families connected by blood to men whose names sit on statues and currency, trace lines the original household ledgers were never written to record. None of those later cases carry the exact combination the Hemings family had: a documented family testimony 125 years old, a peer-reviewed scientific journal, and a founding father whose face already sat on the national currency. But the underlying pattern, a planter class that fathered children it refused to name, followed by descendants who either carried the story forward openly or folded that fact into a new racial identity to survive, repeats itself across the DNA results of families connected to a striking number of the men history remembers as founders. The Hemings case did not create that pattern. It simply became the one instance detailed and public enough that the rest of the country could no longer pretend the pattern belonged to a single household on a single mountain. What the DNA evidence and the plantation paperwork together expose is a single mechanism operating in two directions at once. On one side, Virginia's racial and legal system, and the social world built on top of it, made it structurally impossible for Sally Hemings' children to be acknowledged as Jeffersons on any document that mattered. Not a birth record, not a will naming them as heirs, not a single letter in a collection of thousands. On the other side, that same system left open a narrow and specific escape route, the option to simply stop being classified as black at all, and several of Jefferson's own children took that route as soon as it was available to them. The erasure did not happen once. It happened twice, first when the law refused to record their parentage honestly, and again when their own descendants, for entirely understandable reasons of safety and opportunity, chose to let a different racial identity replace the one the law had assigned them. Both erasures left a trace. The first left a silence in Jefferson's own papers that 2 centuries of historians filled with doubt on his behalf. The second left a scattering of census entries across Ohio and Wisconsin that simply stopped mentioning Monticello at all. The 1998 results did not stay confined to a scientific journal for long. Within days of publication, the study ran as a cover story in a national news magazine and led news broadcasts across the country, treated by much of the press as a genuine revelation rather than a confirmation of something an entire family had already spent 125 years saying plainly. Editorial pages that had spent a century treating the Hemings account as an unfounded slander against a founding father now had to explain, in the same publications, why a family's sworn testimony had been dismissed for so long, while a laboratory result carried instant, uncontested authority. The imbalance in whose evidence had always been believed was, for a brief period in the national conversation, harder to avoid than it had ever been before. Monticello itself did not formally acknowledge any of this as institutional fact until fairly recently. For most of the 20th century, tour guides at the property either omitted Sally Hemings from the story entirely or mentioned her only as an unproven rumor attached to a great man's biography, a footnote rather than a family. That changed only after the 1998 DNA study forced the issue into the open, and it changed further in 2018, when the Thomas Jefferson Foundation opened a permanent exhibit inside Monticello's south wing, identifying and restoring the small room believed to have been Sally Hemings' own living quarters, a space that had previously been converted into a men's restroom for museum visitors. The exhibit exists now specifically because the DNA evidence, combined with decades of oral history the Hemings descendants had never stopped telling each other, finally carried enough institutional weight to move a bathroom and put a name back on a room. The Getting Word Oral History Project, run by Monticello's own research staff, has spent years since then collecting testimony directly from descendants of the enslaved community there, Hemings family members included, gathering precisely the kind of family memory that had been treated for 2 centuries as beneath the level of a footnote. Descendants from both the Hemings and Woodson branches of the family have, in the years since the DNA results became public, begun attending joint reunions at Monticello itself, standing on the same mountaintop their ancestors were once bought, sold, and eventually freed from, this time by invitation rather than by ownership. Some of those descendants carry the Hemings name still, others carry Jefferson, Woodson, or a surname adopted somewhere along a 19th century census form by a grandparent who needed a new one. Genealogists working with the Monticello community, the organization that now formally represents descendants of the people enslaved there, continue to trace additional family lines each year, filling in branches that neither the plantation ledger nor the 1873 newspaper account ever recorded. The mountaintop that once kept a rigorous written account of every enslaved birth while refusing to name a single father now keeps a different kind of record, built out of DNA results, oral history interviews, and descendants willing to say a name in public that Jefferson himself never once put on paper. The house still stands the way its builder wanted it to. The family he tried to keep out of the written record stands there too, in person, on the anniversary weekends when the reunions are held, close enough to touch the same brick he laid 2 centuries before any laboratory existed to prove what he never would. Somewhere in a drawer or a filing cabinet belonging to one of those descendants sits a modern DNA test result, a plain printed report from a mail-in kit, carrying the same rare genetic marker Eugene Foster's team first identified in 1998, still being passed down, still telling the truth. Jefferson's own paperwork was built to avoid. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.